Alabama dominates Ohio State to win their sixth national title under Nick Saban. Clemson's Trevor Lawrence declares for the NFL draft, and we look at the way too early top 25 for next season. I'm Jay Smith, and this is After Further Review.
And now, after further review, a Clemson student's perspective on sports.
There's a personal foul on number 99 of the defense. After he tackled the quarterback, he's giving them business down there. That's a 15-yard penalty.
Well, welcome everyone. I am Jay Smith, and yes, this is After Further Review. And this is the season finale. This is season 5 of AFR. Hard to believe this is our 124th episode, and we're wrapping up season 5. Season is over now. Alabama has won the national championship over Ohio State. They accomplished that earlier this week. Pretty dominant performance by the Crimson Tide, and that was something that I felt like was bound to happen coming into that game. I said, at the time, I expected Alabama to win handily. I was thinking in the range of either 17 to 21 points. I thought it was going to be a 3-possession victory for Alabama, and ended up being the case. Kind of a sweet turnaround for Alabama. A team that 2 years ago lost to Clemson out in the Bay Area in the national championship by 28 points, right? The 44-16 deficit. And 2 years later, they win the national championship over Ohio State by 28 points. So, like I said, it's a 2-year turnaround for Alabama, and they really did it by focusing on something that Nick Saban typically doesn't put a lot of emphasis on, which is offense, right? Nick Saban has always been a defensive-first kind of coach, a coach that treats the quarterback position as more of a liability than an asset. I mean, he's had some great quarterbacks through his tenure at Alabama, but Saban's approach to not just quarterbacks, but also really offense in general is, hey, limit your mistakes. We'll put you in position to make plays, but, your job is really to move the ball down the field methodically, put points on the board, not make mistakes, don't turn the ball over. And it's really his emphasis on defense in the past that's given Alabama their national championships. And I've seen a lot out there recently, some fluff pieces written about why this is the most historic, Alabama team in history and all this. And it's really interesting to see people try and twist Alabama finally putting an emphasis on offense as them having the most dominant team of all time, or this is the most dominant Alabama team of all time. I don't really think that's the case. It was pretty obvious if you watched Alabama this season. They had some major issues on defense. I mean, the Ole Miss game is the perfect example where, the Rebels really had no business competing against Alabama, but were able to do so late into the fourth quarter, largely because Alabama had no answer on defense for Ole Miss's offense and what Lane Kiffin was throwing at them. Now, they certainly cleaned things up as the season progressed. You could look at Alabama as a team that started sloppy and got better. I think you could make the opposite argument for Clemson, a team that started sharp and then got sloppy. I definitely think Clemson was playing great when they were, earlier in the season, right? They're playing Miami, thrashing them. Even the Notre Dame game, I was more impressed with that performance for Clemson than anything I saw in the second half of the season for them. I mean, their performance in the ACC championship game was solid, but it wasn't unexpected. And obviously the Sugar Bowl stands out as a bit of a sore spot for Clemson and not the way that they wanted their season to end. But Clemson's been in this situation before. I mean, they've had rather embarrassing losses in the postseason. That Orange Bowl from 2011 against West Virginia certainly sticks out. That resulted in the firing of then, at the time, defensive coordinator Kevin Steele from Clemson. Dabo fired him and hired Brent Venables. So Clemson's been in this situation before. I think if they put an emphasis on, really sharpening up their secondary this offseason, that they can, not just get back to a playoff, but they can compete in a playoff. That's something that Clemson has done better than almost anybody else is getting to playoffs, but also competing in playoffs. You see teams like Notre Dame or Oklahoma or Washington, right, that get to the playoff, but they don't compete in the playoff. Clemson, except really for this game against Ohio State and Alabama in 2018 in the Sugar Bowl, those are really the only two times that Clemson hasn't competed in the playoff, right? Because every other time they've made the national championship, right? Clemson has had 6 college football playoff appearances in a row. They've made the national championship 4 times. They're 2-2 in the national championship, but they have 2 losses in the semifinal. So I mean, you're 4-2 in semifinal games and 2-2 in national championship games. That's not a bad record. I think anybody in the country would take that, even Alabama, because Alabama missed the playoff last season, right? So again, I think with Clemson, they've been here before, where they're coming off of a bad loss to cap off the season, and it's mostly the fault of the defense. Trevor Lawrence was certainly rattled in his game against Ohio State, and we're going to get into the breakdowns of each of these games extensively here in a second, but just kind of overall thoughts, right? Overall thoughts on the college football playoff. Trevor Lawrence didn't play poorly against Ohio State, but he was rattled. He was rattled the whole night, and I think throwing for what was his stat line, he was like 400 yards passing, 2 touchdowns. Had good numbers, but you could tell. He had multiple fumbles, right? It just wasn't a clean game. Yeah, he was 33 for 48. So for 400 yards, 2 touchdowns again, like I said, but the turnovers and the fact that he really wasn't able to move the ball with his legs, right? He was -8 yards rushing, certainly hindered Clemson in this game. Of course, though, Travis Etienne's the real big, glaring, omission from this Clemson offense, and that's something I have said all year. I've had this conversation with multiple people, and I've said, listen, Etienne's going to go down as one of the best backs in not just Clemson history, ACC history. This is a record set. This guy is a once-in-a-generation kind of talent, but he has had a disappointing season. Maybe not by, the standard of everybody else, right? If you stack it up and you say, well, the average is this and he's still up here, okay, yeah, but what we saw from him in the past few seasons compared to what we're getting now, it's just not the same. He hasn't been the same dynamic, explosive playmaker that we saw in the 2018, national title. So I think those things certainly stuck out to me in the Sugar Bowl, but you have to give credit to Ohio State. They came into this game against Clemson motivated, probably a little bit irritated because of all the talk that they had heard, about not deserving to be in the playoff. And I'm not even discussing the comments that Dabo made. I mean, certainly something I think that will haunt him. Probably one of the worst mistakes he's made while he has been a head coach at Clemson. And it came back and it bit him in the butt. And hopefully some of that, hopefully he eats some of that humble pie and understands. Listen, for so many years, right, Clemson was the underdog. Clemson was the team that was disrespected. Y'all don't deserve to be here. You play in the ACC. Yeah. That was the mantra, right? And Dabo fed off of that. And he cultivated a culture at Clemson that was a perennial underdog that, was always looking to prove themselves. Well, that doesn't really work anymore. Okay, that doesn't really work anymore because you're not the underdog. You're the big blue blood, almost dynasty-like program. And when you're coming out here and you're giving coaches cannon fodder, saying, well, they haven't played any games, so they should be out of the side of the top 10. I mean, that to me, that is just, it's kind of like that quote, right, in The Dark Knight. You either die a hero or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain. And in a lot of ways, specifically with this season, Dabo Swinney has managed to kind of create a little bit of a villain complex. And I don't know how he will respond to that. I don't know how his team will respond to that. I mean, we've seen how the fans have responded to it, right? If you go on Twitter, if you go on Facebook, and you're in those Facebook groups, and you see how Clemson fans, I mean, they are vehemently defending their coach, which is, I don't think, the wrong decision, but at the same time, look, Alabama fans have been this, had to be this way for years, right? Nick Saban, world-class coach, in my opinion, the greatest coach of all time, even before the 7 national titles. Just what he built in the era that he built it in. They've had to deal with being, the team that everybody loves to hate, and that's not something Clemson has ever had to deal with. So I'm not sure how the program is going to respond to that, because if Dabo continues to give other coaches and teams and fans cannon fodder, it's only going to continue to get worse. So that's a big takeaway. Like removing the football discussion for a minute, one of the other things about this college football playoff that I'm taking away is that Dabo, for whatever reason, this year, I mean, again, it's that Dark Knight quote, right? You either die a hero or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain. And I think Dabo Swinney has caused a little bit of that. He's put that on himself this year. So we'll see how he approaches things next year. We'll see if he takes a softer tone. I would imagine he will regroup. At least what he should do is he should regroup and say, okay, guys, I created too much outside noise. There was too much external noise last year. We weren't focusing on being our best team each week. Let's just go back and focus on internally, get all that stuff figured out, and let's go win some football games. That's probably the course of action he should take. We'll have to see, though, what he does. I mean, we'll have to see. I mean, he's got a new quarterback coming in, right, DJ. Some guys have said they're coming back, like Justin Ross, who was out all of 2020 with a spinal condition. You got Skalski coming back, the leader, the heart and soul of the defense. You got to hope that the secondary gets a little bit better. But Clemson certainly has a long laundry list of things that they need to work on this offseason if they want to compete in a college football playoff next year. I didn't say get to one, okay? They have the talent inherently to make it. If Clemson shows up every week and plays a B-level football game, I think they're going to be back in the college football playoff for a 7th straight year. Okay, the ACC is still not quite there in challenging Clemson on a week-to-week basis. Are there teams in the ACC that could beat Clemson? Hello, UNC? Yeah, I think there are. But the entire body of the ACC is just not there yet. Okay, it's not there yet. So Clemson should make it back to the college football playoff next season. I don't think that should be their concern. Their concern is having the right mentality to compete in whatever game they are, put in. That's where I'm at with Clemson. Ohio State, I feel, was so, and I'm switching gears now, talking about Clemson right now. We're going to talk about Ohio State. Ohio State was so consumed with their quest for vengeance. I must have my revenge. Against Clemson, right? They're 0-4 all time against them. They had heard. There's just a really interesting dynamic between South Carolinians and Ohioans. Just this intense dislike for each respective state. And I've asked a lot of people, not even Clemson fans, that are in South Carolina, that's the number one state you dislike the most? And if it's not New Jersey, it's usually Ohio. And that's not a direct relation to football. It's just interesting. It's an interesting dynamic that I have observed. And for whatever reason, I think Ohio State was so consumed with beating Clemson, which obviously they did pretty emphatically, that they lost. They put everything into that game. And so then when they got to the national championship game, they just the wheels kind of came off, right? The wheels kind of came off. And it never felt like they really were competing in this game. It always felt like Alabama had them at arm's length, and they were running to catch up, but they never really could get there, and it never felt like they were going to close the gap. And, I don't think this is a disappointing year for Ohio State. Obviously, they showed a lot of people, hey, we can compete against teams like Clemson that have been in the playoff now for 5-6 years. We can beat them handily. however, have only played. I mean, they only played 8 games? Yeah, they were 6-0. They were 6-0 when they finished with the Big Ten championship. And they finished the season 7-1. It's a weird year for Ohio State. It's a weird year for the Big Ten. Obviously, the leadership of the Big Ten set that conference back, I think, a good bit. Ohio State redeemed it a little bit by making – now, let's say Ohio State plays Clemson, right, and they just get destroyed. They get decimated. Then the conversation becomes, wow, the Big Ten just screwed their teams over this year. They didn't give enough time to prepare. The season started too late. They didn't have enough games under their belt, but that obviously didn't happen. So I think they saved a little bit of face there. But if you're Ohio State, I guess your signature win here is really Clemson, because you won the Big Ten championship. But as we've talked about for weeks, the Big Ten collapsed in on itself like 2 weeks into the season, right? Penn State couldn't win a football game for over a month. Michigan is Michigan. Minnesota and Wisconsin were extremely inconsistent. You did have an Indiana team that was a bit of a Cinderella story there for a while. Northwestern, I think, is continuing to slowly progress. But that's it, man. That's pretty much it for Ohio State. So I think if you're a Buckeye fan, you circle this win in the Sugar Bowl and you say that in and of itself, this win, whether this is justified or not, this is the signature thing that we did in the 2020 season, is we beat Clemson, and we beat them bad, right? We beat them by 3 touchdowns, 49-28. So I think that's the big takeaway. Justin Fields certainly showed, I think, a lot of people what he was capable of. I mean, I was super impressed with his performance in the Sugar Bowl. And listen, I knew he was a great quarterback before watching this game, but I think, his composure and his resolve, right, and his determination after taking the hit against Skalski, he was clearly in pain. I'm not going to get into the politics of the the controversy surrounding him going into the medical tent, there not being a diagnosis, and they're sending him out on the field. I haven't seen anything new come out about that, but I have to give credit to him, the player, for putting his pads back on, getting back out there, and finishing that game and finishing it well. So I think that's the big thing for Ohio State. All right, let's switch over now to the other two teams we got to talk about. That's Notre Dame and Alabama. For Notre Dame, this is a team that I think of all the college football playoff teams, okay, of all of them, so of Clemson, Alabama, Ohio State, Notre Dame, I think Notre Dame had really the most to gain coming into this college football playoff, right? Because remember, Alabama and Clemson are established juggernauts that pretty much make the playoff every year. They, bar a couple games, they compete every year. Ohio State's last playoff appearance was the inaugural year of the College Football Playoff in 2014, and they faced off against, I think, Alabama in that championship and beat the Tide. But, Notre Dame, right, has been in this situation before, but they haven't impressed. They haven't done really much of anything. The last time Clemson played them in the playoff, they lost 30-3 in the Cotton Bowl. I mean, the Fighting Irish, they win their regular season, they get ranked really high, and then they get in the playoff, and they just collapse. And, I feel like this 14-31 loss wasn't awful, but you have to understand that Alabama was in complete control of this game, and it never felt like Notre Dame really had a chance to upset Alabama. And I think that's the biggest frustration of Irish fans. And what makes them the laughingstock of a lot of other fan bases around the country is that Notre Dame just can't get over the hump in these big games. They're the Clemson, right? Clemson, when they get to these big games, more often than not, they win. I mean, Clemson's going to have a loss every once in a while. Okay, they're human. Like, even as a Clemson alum and a Clemson fan, like, I have to kind of recalibrate my expectations and go, okay, wait a minute. Clemson lost 2 games this year, and I'm considering that like an off year. Like, 2 losses is an off year, even in the year of COVID where people are playing a few games. Like, if Clemson loses a game, it's like, what's happening? You know what I mean? And as a Clemson fan, 10, 15 years ago, I mean, you were lucky if you went 500. So it's again, the recalibrating of expectations. For Notre Dame, though, they have championship expectations because they have a championship pedigree because they're one of the most storied programs in college football history. So it would be like, it'd be like USC or a Miami, to a lesser degree Tennessee, making these big games and then not competing. But it doesn't happen once. It happens for like 10 straight years. And that really is the big sore spot for Notre Dame, is that they get into these matchups and they just aren't competitive in them. I mean, listen, Ian Book, was a great quarterback for Indy. Indy had a lot of weapons this season, but you've got to feel like a 10-2 finish for the Fighting Irish is not where they wanted to be. And they had the opportunity, right? They had the opportunity to win an ACC championship. I believe if they had done that and they had beaten Clemson, even if they had lost in the semifinal of the CFP, I think their season would feel like, okay, we've accomplished something, right? We won a conference, even though we've never played in it before. We probably never will again unless something changes. Like, we accomplished something this year. I mean, what does Notre Dame have? They have the win against Clemson, right? The number one team in the country at the time. They handed Clemson their first ever loss as the number one team in the country during the regular season, right? Clemson had, as the number one team, Clemson had never lost in the regular season before that game, which is a pretty crazy stat. But, Notre Dame, right? They were playing a Clemson team that didn't have Trevor Lawrence, didn't have 3 stars on defense. There were so many pieces of the Clemson team that were out, and it took double overtime at home to win, that everybody said, oh, well, okay, let's see how the ACC championship goes. And then obviously that game wasn't close. Clemson came out and thoroughly controlled the tempo of that game and beat Notre Dame handily. So if you're Notre Dame, you're sitting here and you're 10-2, and you have another appearance in the CFP, which is turned into another loss, and you go, man, how much longer? How much longer are we going to be so close? How much longer are we going to be, just shy of breaking through? I don't know when it's going to happen, but there will come a day when Notre Dame does win a CFP semifinal game. And when they do, I think it's going to feel for their fan base like Ohio State's fan base felt after they beat Clemson for the first time ever. I really do. I mean, Ohio State fans were ecstatic. And that goes back to my previous point where I felt like Ohio State fans were so all consumed with beating Clemson that their focus, and it's not just the fans, it's the team, it's the coaches, everybody, their focus for the national championship almost wasn't even there. And if you're a good coach, you understand, you're preparing for the immediate game, right? You're preparing for that next game on the slate, but you also have to be mindful of who you might play next. And I don't think Ohio State was really doing that. I don't think they were thinking that far ahead. I think they were just like, we have to beat Clemson. So for Notre Dame, it's going to be a big deal when they finally break through. I don't think this is a disappointing year. I mean, they had an undefeated regular season. That hasn't happened, for many teams ever. I mean, it's one of many for the Fighting Irish, but still, it probably, I would say, left a very bad taste in a lot of fans and players' mouths to start 10-0 and then, drop the last 2 games in the ACC Championship and the College Football Playoff semifinal. I mean, both games where you had an opportunity to prove something, to show people on a national level that you can compete with the big dogs. You beat Clemson or Alabama. It's impressive. A full-strength Clemson or Alabama. Beating Clemson in the regular season, it was a good win. It was a good win for Notre Dame. It was a big confidence booster for them. But they had an opportunity to play Clemson and Alabama in back-to-back games, and they were thoroughly beat down in both, which now leads me to Alabama. This is an Alabama team, obviously, that finished the season undefeated, 13-0, and this is the third straight year the national champion has been undefeated. We had Clemson in 2018 that was 15-0, first modern college football team to do it ever. Then we had LSU in 2019 that was 15-0 with Joe Burrow, who I think they beat 6 or 7 ranked teams, something crazy. And then obviously this Alabama team, right, of 2020, which finished 13-0. Now, some people have tried to say that Alabama is, this is the greatest Alabama team ever, this is the greatest football team ever, this is the greatest, They have an offense. But all you have to do is, people like to spout off lots of nonsense, but numbers never lie. And all you got to do is look at the number differential. And if you actually go and you look at, the point differential for the last 3 CFPs, if you ranked them, the national champions, Clemson, LSU, Alabama, would it surprise you to learn that Alabama ranks 3rd in point differential? LSU is 2nd, and Clemson is 1st. Alabama, I think, was 49, plus 49. LSU's plus 52, and Clemson was plus 55 in their respective national championship seasons. Now, that was a lot of talk in 2018 about Clemson being the first 15-0 college football team ever, since like 1890. Are they the best ever? And I don't really think that's a fair question because it's impossible to know because you can't compare what Clemson did in 2018 to what USC did in the early 2000s, or what Miami did in the late 90s, or what Florida State did under Bobby Bowden, or what Notre Dame did, way back when. That's just not a fair comparison because, recruiting was regional. You weren't pulling in. Lots of these schools in the early days of college football were so good because they were hotbeds for talent. Okay, Alabama was a hotbed of talent. That Notre Dame, Indiana, that was a hotbed of talent. Yes, there was some recruiting, but it was largely regional. Okay, Alabama wasn't pulling guys from California in 1940. Maybe one, maybe two, but not like they are today. So it's impossible to make that comparison, and I hate that. I hate that discussion of who's the best, which team's the best team ever. Certainly there are eras of college football that kind of lump years together, like a decade or two, where you could say, okay, of this era of college football, which team is probably the best? I think you could probably have that discussion. But trying to compare the entire, 151 seasons of college football? Yeah, I think it's 151 seasons of college football to compare all those different teams across all those different years, all those different eras, and try and pick the best one, I think is an impossible task, and one that's going to be inherently biased towards the present. You're always going to pick a team that played more recently than one that played 40 years ago, because A, you probably didn't watch them play, B, you may not even have been alive, and C, you're going to be inherently biased towards what happened that you witnessed with your own eyes. That's human nature. That's basic psychology. So, again, to go back to this discussion about Alabama, did they have a great year? Absolutely, they had a great year. They dominated the West. They beat A&M, the only team that was really going to give them a run for their money. They had some sloppy games against Ole Miss. They cleaned some things up. They got through this season with a pretty mediocre defense, but a great offense. And you know what's crazy? Again, as I've talked about this at the top of the show, Saban's always treated the quarterback position like a liability, not an asset, okay? This year, Mac Jones, he was a pretty decent quarterback, but he was by no means a Tua Tagovailoa, okay? He wasn't this dynamic, dual-threat, explosive playmaker kind of guy. He was a dude that managed the system, had matured, coming, into his own a little bit, and he had ridiculously talented skill players to throw to. Now, I'm not saying Mac Jones is a bad football player, but you have to be realistic, okay? You have to be realistic with the fact that Alabama and Nick Saban's coaching philosophy has always been about strong defense and an offense that limits mistakes, an offense that just executes and works like a well-oiled machine. And it's the defense that steps up and wins the big championships. This year kind of flipped the script for Alabama. And it worked, okay? This is something that other teams have tried. Chip Kelly at Oregon, Chad Morris at Clemson. Even Ohio State a little bit kind of got a little bit of no huddle this year. under Ryan Day. I mean, there have been other examples of this. I mean, Big 12, really. I mean, that's an entire conference. I feel like for a while there was all about fast-moving offenses, and their defenses have gotten better in the Big 12. But the point of all this is, Alabama had a great season. They finished 13-0. Devontae Smith winning the Heisman. I've kind of said this for several years about the Heisman. I don't really put a lot of stock in it anymore. Some of the winners that they've chosen the last 5 to 8 years have been pretty disappointing, in my opinion. I don't think Devontae Smith didn't deserve the award. Obviously, the guy is a stud, and I would imagine it's going to make a big impact at the next level. But really for me, and this is something that even people like Trevor Lawrence and some other players around the country have said, we're not really worried about winning the Heisman. We just want to win a national championship. And I kind of take that philosophy too of this is a team sport. Okay, if this is like golf or tennis, yeah, you want to win the award, you want to win the championship because it's a solo thing. But this is a team sport. Okay, it's football. I mean, you can't Trevor Lawrence can be as good as he wants to be, but if he has no one to throw to, or he has no one blocking for him, or no one to hand the ball off to, and Devontae Smith, right, phenomenal athlete, but he also has to have Mac Jones be somewhat competent, right? Mac Jones has to throw the ball so that he can catch it, and so I don't really care about individual awards in a team game. If this is an individual sport, it's a totally different conversation. It's a totally different conversation. But trying to pick, Heisman winner is just, I think it's always going to be biased towards the offense. We've seen that. And I think your team typically has to be in the postseason in a pretty big game. College football playoff, right? You're not going to, I don't think you're going to see another Heisman. I don't think you're going to see a Heisman winner from a team in a New Year's Six bowl. I mean, unless it's just a crazy season. They're going to have to be in the CFP. And more than likely, they're going to have to be in the national championship. So I'm happy for Devontae Smith. Had a great year. Guy is a phenomenal player. But I really don't think Alabama fans care as much about that as they do about winning the national championship. Surely, people put more of an emphasis on the national championship than winning the Heisman. But listen, this pretty much this game for Alabama, right, winning the national championship, it cemented Saban's legacy as the best coach of all time. He's won 6 at Alabama, 7 overall, 1 at LSU. And just in the era that he has done it, and the success that he has had, is just hard to really fathom. It's almost ridiculous. It's almost ridiculous what this man has achieved at his time in Tuscaloosa, and I gotta wonder how many more years he's going to do it. But I think overall for Alabama, it's definitely got to feel good, especially with how they lost 2 years ago, right? As we talked about this earlier in the show, it was this time 2 years ago, Alabama got spanked by Clemson 44-16 in the 2018 national title game. 2 years later, they flipped the script. They beat Ohio State by 28 to win the national title game. And last year they didn't make the playoff. Okay, there's a little bit of a time there where Alabama fans kind of, I don't think they hit the panic button, but there was some tension in Tuscaloosa. This has restored the faith, and we'll have to see how Alabama moves going forward with are they going to focus on explosive offense, or are they going to try and go back to their roots and get their defense? Because again, the defense at times this year was pretty suspect. I mean, Ole Miss was putting up ridiculous numbers against them earlier in the season, but the thing about Alabama was they got better as the season progressed. Notre Dame kind of got a little bit sloppier. Clemson dropped off. I think of the 4 playoff teams, Clemson by far regressed the most this season. I mean, they had, at the beginning, they were just destroying people, and then there was that stretch of 2 to 3 weeks where games were just super tight, and it just, Clemson had a lot of trouble putting away like Syracuse and some other teams they really had no business being in such close games with. But yeah, overall, Alabama's the new national champions, and it's another season of college football in the books. So congrats to the Crimson Tide for their national title. Okay, let's take a break. We come back, we'll talk about Trevor Lawrence. He has declared for the NFL draft. No surprise there. That discussion is on the other side of this break. Welcome back to the show. Again, thanks so much for tuning in. I'm Jay Smith, and you are listening to After Further Review. Season finale of AFR. It's season 5. It's hard to believe. It's 124 episodes of this show. It's taken a lot of different forms over the years, but yeah, this is the end of season 5. Hey, I got a lot of exciting announcements too coming up related to some new logos and some new branding stuff, and we're going to be focusing a little bit more on social content during the off season of college football. But yeah, no, I mean we'll do some episodes this spring certainly, and keep up with some stuff. But I'm excited for that. So it may take a couple of weeks to kind of get some of that stuff ironed out. Let's talk Trevor Lawrence now. And his announcement, put this out on, I think, the 6th of January, it's a little over a week ago, that he is going to he's declared for the NFL draft. He put out a really, I think, well-produced video of him just kind of talking about his experience at Clemson, his legacy, what he wants to be remembered for. And these are things that I think exemplify why Trevor Lawrence, chose Clemson. I mean, his philosophy about really just life in general, I think, is very closely aligned with Dabo Swinney's. I think Clemson was a good fit for him, and I think he enjoyed his time there. Obviously, look, winning the national title as a freshman, going 15-0. Felt great. You hate to see him lose a national title his sophomore season and then not even, win the semifinal game. So it regressed, right, each year, but phenomenal career. 34-2 all time. And, I just hard to even comprehend some of the numbers that he has put up. But, yeah, no, Trevor Lawrence declaring for the NFL draft should really surprise no one. Another announcement, actually, is that Travis Etienne, Clemson's star running back, has also declared for the draft. He's announced that, I believe, earlier today. Clemson does have some notable people, though, coming back. I mean, Skalski has announced that he's going to return. Justin Ross has announced that he will return. But, I think Trevor Lawrence has cemented his legacy at Clemson, and will go down as one of the greatest of all time. Not just for Clemson, but really, college football. I mean, it's hard to ignore everything he accomplished, and that performance against Ohio State in the semifinal game. It's not going to tarnish his legacy. I think he leaves Clemson with his legacy more than secure. He's a national champion. He's a record setter, and he's a winner on and off the field. And that's really part of the culture that Dabo has tried to cultivate at Clemson, is that if guys go to the next level, we prepare them for that, but we're also preparing them to be men outside of college football. And it's really been a great 3 seasons for Trevor Lawrence at Clemson. I think one of the most impressive things about just him is that, after he went 15-0 and won the national championship and dominated the dynasty that is Alabama, right? 44-16, man, as a freshman. I mean, if that didn't put him at number 1 in the draft board, it probably got him pretty close. Is his composure, his poise, and his handling of everything, and all the pressure that was put on him. And he lost to LSU and Ohio State in the CFP, and that was it as a starter. Won every other game as a starter. He led Clemson to the CFP in each of his 3 seasons, and no other quarterback can make that claim. I mean, that's something that very well could stand for a long time. You'd be hard-pressed, I think, to have anybody ever break that, where you have 4 straight years of a quarterback leading his team to a college football playoff experience. There's been a lot made of his involvement and stuff off the field, especially this season. And I think that certainly, again, goes back to the type of culture that Dabo is trying to build at Clemson. And he's done a lot of stuff with teammate Darian Rencher, the recipient of the Disney Spirit Award this season, actually. It's been a great career for Trevor Lawrence. Certainly, I do think he'll be successful in the NFL, and the legacy that he leaves is the winningest quarterback in school history, making 3 straight playoff appearances, winning 3 ACC titles. It's just so impressive that he's done all of those things, accomplished all of that, but still stays very humble. Is always focused about the team. You heard him during the Heisman presentation and even before. It'd be great to win the Heisman. But I'm more worried about winning national championship or winning our next game or whatever. And he said that throughout the regular season, because that he was asked about it almost every week. What do you check the Heisman odds? He's like, I'm just worried about winning our next game, preparing for the postseason. So a class act, all around great guy, and I wish him the best going forward. Certainly hope that he has a long and prosperous NFL career. Okay, well, let's take one last break, and when we come back, let's look at the way too early top 25 that's been released recently. Might surprise you. There's a couple teams up there that are interesting. We'll talk about that next. Welcome back to the show. Last segment of this season finale of After Further Review. Hard to believe, Season 5 of AFR is coming to a close. 124 episodes. Almost complete. It's crazy. Hey, let's talk about the way too early top 25 for the 2021 college football season. Hey, it's just never too early, okay? It's never too early to look at next season. We've mentioned a lot of big names are leaving college football. You're going to have Trevor Lawrence. He's already declared for the draft. Mac Jones for Alabama, Justin Fields for Ohio State may certainly be in that conversation soon. But I think the bigger question, take the 4 CFP teams this season. Let's put them on the back burner for a second. Let's focus on the Georgias, the North Carolinas, the Texas A&Ms. What are those teams going to do to close the gap against the Clemsons and the Alabamas and the Ohio States? That's what I'm interested for next season. That's what I'm intrigued by. Is what are those programs? What are the UNCs going to do? A UNC team that played really well last season, was inconsistent. Sam Howell put up some great numbers. Mac Brown is really turning the program, the culture of UNC around in a hurry. But what's that going to look like? How are they going to compete against Clemson? And hey, Texas A&M. Jimbo Fisher seems to finally be kind of hitting his stride. He's still got to get over the Alabama hurdle, but if he was able to do that this year, what kind of path could A&M have? Could they be making the college football playoff? Georgia is another team you could look at on the east side of the SEC. What does all that look like? So we've got a way too early top 25 here. It was put out by ESPN. Top 5 are Clemson, Alabama, Oklahoma, Georgia, and Ohio State. You might be thinking, that's kind of high for Oklahoma, but they're returning 6 starters on offense, 8 starters on defense. They were 9-2 this past season in 2020. And, you got to think it's been 2 decades since Oklahoma won a national championship. But if things fall into place in 2021, that streak may end. It may end for the Sooners. Spencer Rattler is a guy that started the season rough, right? He did not start well. There was a point there where the wheels were almost falling off the wagon in for Lincoln Riley in Oklahoma, but they figured things out. That's the important. Penn State didn't. Penn State just continued to suck. Oklahoma figured it out. They got through the Texas game, right? They won that. It was like 53-46, and then they rattled off a bunch of Spencer Rattler rattled off. They rattled off a bunch of wins, and they finished 9-2. And I think that's certainly kind of rebuilt the confidence of the players, of the fans, of the coaching staff, and so I think Spencer Rattler will not only be a front runner for the Heisman next year, but Oklahoma's you're going to watch out for the Sooners, not just in the Big 12, but also in the CFP. Georgia, another team in the top 5. They finished 8-2. Their offense made some strides last season, but I just think there's just too much inconsistency with the Bulldogs for them to surpass. They may make it to an SEC championship, and they may be playing in Alabama, or they may be playing at Texas A&M. But I just don't have the confidence in the Bulldogs yet to say definitively, I think they can get done. Look at the Cincinnati game, their bowl game against Cincinnati, right? And Cincinnati was really in control of that game for most of it. Georgia ended up pulling out a win, but I haven't seen, and again, I understand Texas A&M was in the same situation, right? UNC and Texas A&M went toe-to-toe, but that was more a statement about UNC and where they are as a program than Texas A&M is not showing up and they're just not playing well. I was really impressed with UNC in that matchup, and I was really impressed with Cincinnati in their matchup against Georgia. So I'm not sure about Georgia yet. We'll have to see how things shake out for them. Texas A&M, though, the Aggies, they roll in at 6, North Carolina at 7, 2 teams I just mentioned, and those are 2 teams that are going to be good. If you don't think UNC is, not going to compete with Clemson, and if you don't think that A&M is not going to compete with Alabama, I'm just going to have to disagree with you. Because from what I've seen from these teams, I think there's certainly the talent there. UNC has a few inconsistency issues they need to clean up. You can't drop a game to Florida State like you did this past season. But they're returning 8 starters on offense, 10 on defense. That will be huge. Recruiting is continuing to improve. And I think Mac Brown has got this program steered in the right direction. Iowa State comes in at 8, USC, the Trojans at 9, and then Indiana rounds out the top 10. It's a pretty generous spot for the Hoosiers. Listen, last season was one of the better seasons in school history by all metrics for Indiana. It never felt like they really got the credit they deserved. Now, if they had beaten, Ohio State in the Big Ten championship game, I think it's a totally different conversation. But I think Indiana has a lot left to prove, which, sounds unfair because of how much they accomplished last season, but I still think Indiana needs a few more years, at least a year or two, of pretty consistent, top 15, top 20 poll finishes to really convince people. Similar to any school that kind of had to come into prominence, like Clemson. It took them a couple of years in the playoff. It took Clemson until they beat Alabama in 2016 for people to say, okay, they're legit, they deserve a spot. And then in 2018, right when they throttled them, people were like, wow, Clemson is here. And they're here to stay. So Indiana definitely has something left to prove. Cincinnati is 11. They certainly, after their performance against Georgia in the bowl game, they certainly probably feel like they have something left to prove. Listen, you can win the American, and that's all fine and good, but you've got to win your bowl games against Power 5 opponents. There's no excuse for playing like you did in that bowl game. Cincinnati had ample opportunity to win that game. And, it's certainly got to leave a bad taste in their mouth, dropping that game to Georgia in the Chick-fil-A Peach Bowl. Iowa is at 12. Oregon, our first Pac-12 team, is at 13. The Washington Huskies, are at 14. And then Notre Dame are the last college football playoff team from the season prior. They round out the top 15. Notre Dame right now is going to be stuck at 15th. This is largely because of how much talent they're losing on offense. I mean, you're losing, not just Ian Book, but two of your best wide receivers. You're only returning three guys on offense. And, the Fighting Irish, as I've talked about repeatedly throughout this show, have had great seasons, marred by poor performances in the postseason. I mean, with their loss to Alabama in the Rose Bowl, they fell to 0-7 in BCS or New Year's Six bowl games since 1998, and they have been outscored by 161 points in those games, with all 7 losses by at least 14 points. In other words, it's been since 1998 since Notre Dame has been competitive in a big-time game. It's been 22 years. And as I said earlier, when they finally do break that streak, it's going to be huge. It's going to be huge for their culture, huge for the program, huge for the fans, huge for players, coaches, everyone. And listen, they've been good under Brian Kelly. Okay, Brian Kelly, I think, is a couple wins away. He's like maybe 3 wins away from tying Newt Rockne for most wins all time as a Notre Dame head coach. Right, he has 102 right now, and Newt Rockne, I think, had 105, something around that. But he just hasn't gotten them to the point, to the level of the Nick Saban Alabamas and the Dabo Swinney Clemsons. Notre Dame can get there, but they just can't compete, and that is shown in the numbers, right? 0-7 in BCS and New Year's Six bowl games, point differential of minus 161. Every game you've lost by at least 14 points. Those are things that you just can't do if you want to be considered a blue blood team. Florida is at 16, Wisconsin 17, 18 is Ole Miss. Rebels are, I think, they're the first team that finished 500 the prior season to be ranked. Yeah, so I mean we had Wisconsin that was 4-3, and that's one above it at 17. But Ole Miss finished 5-5 last season, 4-5 in the SEC under first-year head coach Lane Kiffin. I think the big thing for Ole Miss, though, is just how many people are returning. You've got you've got Elijah Moore, who's obviously leaving. Kenny Yeboah. I mean, some of the really big offensive production guys, but Matt Corral and John Rice Plumlee now have more experience. You got 8 starters on offense coming back, 9 starters on defense. The defense, though, is going to need a lot of work. If Ole Miss wants to compete, not just in the West, but really in any SEC matchup, they're going to have to get a better defense. You can't outscore everybody in the SEC, because this isn't the Big 12 yet. However, Lane Kiffin did show that his style of offense can work in the SEC, but there's some things they need to refine on defense if the Rebels want to be competitive. 19, we got the Louisiana Raging Cajuns. 20 is LSU, another team that finished 5-5 last season. This was, I think, the first defending national champion to not finish above 500 ever. So a historic drop-off for the LSU Tigers. Not a good year. Not a good year at all for them. They're going to be bringing some guys back, but you got to think that, LSU, they've had to totally recalibrate their expectations. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how Coach O handles expectations going forward. 21, we got Texas. 22 is Penn State. 23, Coastal Carolina. 24, Liberty. And rounding out the top 25, you have the Miami Hurricanes. A pretty interesting, way too early top 25. I agree with most of it. I think some teams are giving them some generous spots, and some teams probably aren't being given enough credit. But, I'd say a notable omission is no BYU. I mean, Zach Wilson obviously is gone, but there's a couple of teams that we saw last season, right? They made a lot of noise that, if one or two guys leave the program, it's kind of assumed that they're going to drop off. Now, we'll see. We'll see what BYU is able to do, but being an independent puts them in an inherent disadvantage. So, you got to think that, they may not be in the conversation. But overall, looking at this, there's certainly a handful of teams that are non-Power 5, most notably Cincinnati, that might be competing for a big-time bowl game at the end of next season. But we'll have to see. But either way, that's been it. That's all the time we got for this edition of After Further Review. Again, this is the season finale. Season 5 of After Further Review is finished. Hard to believe. We'll be picking up Season 6 soon, though. Again, we're going to announce a few things, a little bit of a rebrand, and focus on social during the off season. But certainly we'll be pumping out episodes, maybe do a few guests throughout the spring. But yeah, it's been a lot of fun talking college football. I'm excited that this show has taken the podcast form. Like I said, it's been a lot of different things over the years, but excited to keep it going, and excited that you're still tuning in and listening, because like I said, I do appreciate that, and the feedback that I've gotten, it certainly motivates me to continue making the content. But appreciate you tuning in. I'll see you here pretty soon. I'm Jay Smith, and this has been After Further Review.